Welcome to City Talks, where we discuss the big issues facing UK cities and the latest thinking on urban policy with expert guests. I'm your host, Andrew Carter from the think tank Centre for Cities. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to this episode of City Talks. Today I'm joined by my colleague Oscar Selby, and we're going to have a little look at high streets. Prime ministers may change, but the prominence of high streets in the national debate endures, and there's some good reasons why that is the case. Highly visible and strongly symbolic. I think people really do think about the high streets, both in the sense of what's available on them, how often they go there, the types of shops, but they also use the high street as a bellwether for how they feel about their place more broadly. And politicians, unsurprisingly, pick this up. The term high streets has been mentioned in Parliament more than 3,000 times over the last 5 years, which tells you that our politicians are aware of this kind of issue. Why are we talking about it today on the 17th of August? Well, we have a new Prime Minister. The Prime Minister has been in post for nearly 4 weeks, a month. And in that period, he's already said two things, at least, on high streets and other things that will relate to it. So he started off pretty much within a week of becoming the Prime Minister talking about business rates and actually variation for socially valuable high street businesses as he thought about that. So pubs, social clubs, live music venues, recognising that they may need some preferential treatment within the business rate system, a reflection that he wants to see these sorts of things endure. And then more recently, last week, actually talked about on the flip side, giving places more control over bad stuff. That's my terminology, not his, but actually thinking about the high streets mix and actually giving places more control to the extent to which they can decide whether they want another betting shop or another gaming centre or indeed another vape shop. So it's come round twice, all in the cost of living context. But I think, Oscar, what we'll also do through the conversation is actually connect it, particularly in the second half, to the broader economic policy agenda, which is growth in every postcode, more productivity, higher wages, more prosperity, etc.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's the thing we really want to emphasize. There's sort of two ways to look at high streets. They're a place for community, a place for social gathering, but they also play this economic function as well. And part of the reason why they're so high up the government's agenda is because they have that dual function, that they're really important places to meet people and to experience a place. But they're also employers. They provide lots of jobs to people maybe without highest level qualifications. And so they're really important for local economies as well.
Yeah, and just to back that up with a bit of polling, I think Ipsos did some polling a little while ago. 78%, so nearly 80%, 4 in 5 Britons say having high street in their local area is really important to them. Over a third said it was very important. 50% go to the high streets at least once a month. Maybe that's a problem. They only go there once a month, but also saying that they didn't feel like their high streets were as successful or as vibrant or as dynamic or as attractive as they previously been. So again, it's just a sort of recognition that in the general public that the high street is a particular issue. And then on the flip side, quite a bit of polling highlighted again today in some work that Will Jennings and his colleagues had out. There's a connection between how you feel about your area, so your pride of your area, and how you feel about the high streets.
Yeah, definitely. It seems to be something that is at the top of people's agenda. It's something that local policymakers are always conscious of, because it is also one of those things that local government have a decent amount of control over.
Yeah.
Right. So particularly interested in addressing it as a policy area.
And obviously, early days of the new PM, and very, very rightly, he sort of started with a cost of living emphasis. But interestingly, I think both of the interventions he made on high streets has been on the composition side, thinking about what's on the high street or what should be on the high street. And again, that's understandable in some respects. And we do know, you've been doing this work for a very long time, but we do know that the makeup of our high streets is changing. They're not the same as they were for reasons that we understand, but they are changing. So it's a sort of interesting initial foray and discussion into the composition question, rather than taking a step back and saying, well, what's actually driving the performance of different high streets?
Yeah, definitely. That's a really good point. I think from our research, when we look at how the composition of UK's high streets are changing, the biggest thing that's changing the composition of the high street is the impact of online shopping, right? And certain businesses that are more vulnerable to competition from online shopping have struggled to compete and have often had to close down. And in some places, that leads to empty shops. In other places, that leads to a change of use, and it leads to a different type of use that is more competitive with online retail. And those are things that have to be consumed on site. So that means that retailer might be replaced by a restaurant, might be replaced by a gym, but the extent to which that change occurs towards a new type of shop or an empty shop is heavily determined by the strength of the broader economy and how much money people have to spend. Because the private sector are less likely to move into a shop that's closed down in a place where disposable income is low, because they don't necessarily have confidence that people will be eating out 2-3 times a week, and that will support a new restaurant. And we see this when we look across the country. If you look at the geography of empty shops in different city centres, vacancies are probably a little bit higher than they were 10, 15 years ago everywhere. But there's a significant difference across the country. And in places like London, Brighton, Cambridge, York, where disposable income is higher alongside other factors, vacancy rates are much lower. So only around 1 in 15 shops are empty in the city centre. If you go to other parts of the country, it gets up to about 1 in 5. So there's a big difference depending on where you are in the country.
Yeah, and that's a really important point because obviously, often the news and the headline picks up the plight of the high street, the decline of the high street. But actually, in some places, the high streets are doing fine. In some respects, they're doing really well. They remain prominent places for activity. But the point you were making there, quite right, is that they are everywhere. They are becoming less retail dominated, and they're, the ones that are successful have been able to pivot away from retail per se into other activities for a bunch of reasons we'll get into. So, it's not the high streets are struggling everywhere, but they're all adapting and changing or having to adapt and change. And the degree to which they can do that, particularly away from retail, gives us a good insight as to when we walk the high street, whether we see empty units of whatever persuasion or filled units of whatever persuasion.
Yeah, that's precisely the point. I think there is clearly a demand, and you see this in the higher income places where people have enough money to spend. There is a demand to go out and spend money on the high street. It's just not the same demand. It's not the demand for the same types of goods that there previously were. And that's why it's really important to emphasize that people want to be on the high street. That's why it's so prominent in this polling data. That's why politicians care about it. It's their capacity to spend on the high street that really determines its success.
Yeah.
So policy interventions that focus on that spending power are really the things that are going to lead to the long-term success of the high street.
Yeah. So you've looked at this indeed, but as you say, we looking at the national picture and particularly then a much deeper investigation into the hundreds of high streets across London. Just say a little bit about what's going on in different types of high streets, the patterns that we see. Because again, this is partly a sort of composition question, and different high streets in different places do have different things on them, right?
Yeah, definitely. So we did a piece of work about a year ago now, looking at London's high streets and its suburban high streets. And what we found is that there's broadly 3 different types of high streets within London. Across the country, there's even more. But within a local economy, you have the city centre high streets and you have the primary high streets. These tend to be quite retail focused. This is where you find your like anchor retailers, large businesses. This is like destination shopping centres, those kinds of things. Then you have secondary and tertiary high streets, and secondary and tertiary high streets tend to provide groceries, supermarkets, the kinds of goods that you would be picking up on the way home from work, for example. These are providing these service smaller catchments, smaller number of customers, and play a different role. They have a different function. And I think that policymakers should be conscious of that. The interventions that would be relevant to a city centre or to a primary high street are going to be different to those that are relevant to a secondary or tertiary high street.
Yeah, because it's sort of interesting. There's a sort of implicit and explicit. On the one hand, if policy stops a certain thing from happening, a bad thing, as it were, however that is defined by policy, that a good thing will come in of its place. Now, that may happen, but that in itself might need additional policy intervention. If we assume that the market will just simply take up that opportunity with a different offer that is quite different from what's currently there on the high street, that's a much harder argument to win.
Yeah, definitely. The idea that you can improve the quality or maybe just the price point of the business on your high street just by removing or making it illegal to put in lower quality businesses is probably challenging without any additional support. Because the reason why those lower quality businesses or those businesses that are providing a different type of good that maybe is seen as less desirable, the reason why they're moving in is because those higher quality, again, this is all highly normative, higher quality businesses aren't moving in because they don't believe that there's enough demand in that local economy. So a really good example of this is gambling, betting shops, for example. There's loads of research that shows that betting shops are more common in areas of high deprivation. And this has lots of negative social effects that policymakers should be conscious of. And maybe it is worthwhile banning it and removing it from the high street. I think there's a lot of merit to that argument. But we should be conscious that if you ban a betting shop, you're not necessarily going to have Gales moving in to try and provide high value, high price, essentially, goods and services to a community that isn't able to spend the money to afford that, essentially.
Yeah, it's a great point around trying to think about what will come in their stead. And again, it's interesting. Some of the discussion has been about actually acquiring those premises either on a short or medium term basis and using them for non-retail uses, community uses, or social uses to reflect that fact that actually there's an underlying demand question as to whether those units would be taken up, and the transition from one thing to the next, can be difficult and/or could take much longer than you would ideally want it to happen.
Yeah, it can, but that probably is the best long-term solution. You either accept that, okay, if you ban these uses that are undesirable, you're probably going to have a higher rate of empty shops, or you ban those uses and then additionally you do some kind of public subsidy where government agencies, well, you have more healthcare centres in the town centre to take up the shops, or you do things like turning empty shops into residential and you provide planning permission to allow developers to change it from a commercial unit towards a residential unit. And that can have benefits as well, because that can also increase the amount of demand for the remaining shops because people live nearby, there's more footfall, and the remaining businesses, even though there are fewer of them, get more support and they can survive, essentially.
So just connect that out. Let's just sort of take a step back, connect that to slightly some of the broader debate by looking at some of the factors that we've identified that actually drive the success or otherwise of high streets. And in some respects, both a overall vibrancy, variety, dynamism, and then obviously the composition related to that, in part reflects, as you've already said, the amount of money in people's pockets and the amount of pockets that are available to that high street. So just say a little bit about that, because again, this is a broader point.
Yeah.
It's not a surprise that we've seen discount retailers, for example, come onto our high streets when we've had very little wage growth across the country for the last 15 or 20 years. If you don't have much money in your pocket, by definition, you have to go shopping, firstly, probably slightly less often, but also when you go shopping, you're looking for the cheaper option for obvious and sensible reasons. So just say a little bit about, talk us through the prosperity in the pocket and the numbers of pockets. And that's really, really quite important, right?
Yeah. And I think the best way to frame this thinking is to emphasize that high streets are an outcome of the local economy. They're not necessarily a driver. So the way to think of that is that you can essentially split local economic businesses into two different types. You can look at local services, which are businesses that are almost limited to selling to the local community, the people who live within the local economy within a commutable distance. And then you have exporting or tradable businesses, which are businesses that sell to the local community, but they also sell to people elsewhere. And those are the businesses that bring money into the local economy. They're the ones that pay the highest wages. They tend to employ large numbers of people, and they provide the level of disposable income that supports the local services. Exporting or tradable businesses would be things like financial services, software companies, IT, tech, but also manufacturing as well. The businesses that produce things that sell to the rest of the region, the rest of the country, and the rest of the world. And that drives disposable income. That is then spent on the high street, and that supports the success of the high street. And when we look across the country and we look at how vacancy rates, so the share of shops that are empty, varies across the country, we find it's the strength of the tradable businesses that tends to determine the amount of disposable income people have and the level of empty shops there are. So there are fewer empty shops in places with stronger tradable businesses. And that's really the fundamental driver. There are other factors that determine high street success, but that's the biggest in our view. Things like the size of the catchment, so your proximity to other competitive retail centres can be quite important. If there's a big out-of-town retailer, that might hurt the city centre a little bit because it takes some of the customers away. But again, the important thing to emphasize is that if you raise incomes, people will be able to spend in both places. If you just remove transport links to out of town shopping centers, you're working in a zero sum game.
Yeah.
So it's really incomes and growing the economy, supporting the tradable base that provides this positive sum support for high streets across the country.
Yeah, so I think again, just to emphasize that point around increasing the numbers of jobs in a place and preferably having lots of those jobs being paid, a good wage, then creates opportunities for people to have money in their pocket to come out and spend. And then that's you're at least in a more favourable environment where you're trying to attract the pound rather than try and invent the pound in the first place. I mean, the other thing, obviously, to say, we're recording this on the 17th of August, and we're about to get announcement from the government on latest rounds of planning reform, which is essentially to allow housing to be built in highly accessible, more accessible places. Obviously, our cities are, by definition, accessible locations, or at least they should be. And so one of the other ways that we're often talking about how you regenerate city centres, how you regenerate town centres, high streets, is actually getting more people to live close to them, so they're on the high street rather than having to travel to the high street. That's why urban housing is part and parcel of the high streets agenda, as much as whatever we do on a shop front or a retail front, or on a business rates front.
Yeah, definitely. So building more houses in the city centre can really support city centre businesses, primarily because it provides more footfall, so there's just more customers, but also because if you provide more housing and you do that at a faster rate than the population is growing, you will likely see a increase in the affordability of housing. And when housing is slightly more affordable, that means people have more money to spend at the end of the month after housing costs, and that means they can spend more on the high street to support those businesses.
Yeah, and that connects to the broader economic policy agenda, which the new Prime Minister has also expressed, and again said this pretty much on day one, and was saying it beforehand, which is an aspiration and intention to think about how we get growth in every postcode, because actually access to prosperity is not just good for high streets. Obviously, it's good for the economy more generally, but you can see how these things then begin to coalesce around a relatively integrated economic policy, even if we're talking about them sometimes in a way that is not immediately obvious, particularly to those that like more serious sounding words and jargon.
Yeah, I think that high streets can play a really important role in generating good growth, or growth that's inclusive. Because, like I said, you can see these tradable or exporting businesses as sort of the drivers of local economies. They pay the highest wages. They provide lots of jobs in order to ensure that there are enough jobs for everyone in the community, and to ensure that those high-paying jobs are benefiting other people in the community. That has to transfer over to those high-paid individuals spending money on the high street, paying the wages of people that maybe didn't get access to the qualifications that would allow them to access those tradable jobs, but they can be employed on the high street and they can be supported by the people who are earning those salaries.
Yeah.
So it ensures that there is this inclusivity with growth at the same time. If it's all done online and it's done in businesses elsewhere, there are jobs in certain things like logistics which can be generated and are valuable, but this spillover, this multiplier effect isn't as significant.
And I think that the other thing just to emphasize is just the importance then again of the place-based agenda, because we've already talked about lots of different types of interventions: business rates, which is a fiscal financial intervention; housing, employment, transport, skills, all of those different aspects that we've touched on. They need coordinating and integrating, and that can only really be done at the place level. But also, I think, again, connecting the devolution argument and agenda that the new Prime Minister most definitely has, is actually giving the mayors and local authorities the powers and the capabilities and the resources to make this happen. Because you can have the policy aspiration to X and Y, but if you don't have those institutions to make it happen, particularly because this stuff is hard, it's not easy. If it was easy, we'd see more of it happening. But having the mayors and the combined authorities as the primary institutions for making this happen, bringing other actors together, is actually as an important part of the agenda as much as what the policy is on retail or what the policy is on transport.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. Mayors in particular are very important in this, because if we talk about this multiplier effect of sort of the tradable businesses, which tend to locate in the city centre, if the mayor is using his access to tax revenue that's generated by those tradable businesses, it can then use that tax revenue to support high streets and support employers maybe outside of the city centre in businesses that are further away from the frontier, but still really important from an employment perspective. And so doing it on a mayoral level as opposed to a local authority level can be really valuable in allowing for this citywide sort of redistribution to make the growth that gets generated in their place accessible to everyone in that city.
And that's what a serious high street strategy would look like. It wouldn't look like something that worries overly about the particular makeup of individual streets, or whether there's too much of X or too much of Y. the serious strategy would do exactly that. It would take a step back and actually put the high streets in the context of the economy, the local economy in which it sits. And again, when we look back over 10, 15 years, too much of the high street conversation has been at the high street level for understandable reasons. But it's also why we don't see the change or the amount of change that we would ideally and we need to see.
Yeah, precisely, because high streets, like I said, are an outcome. And if you focus on the outcome, you're treating the symptom, you're not treating the cause. Focusing on the fundamental, which is the disposable income's too low, housing costs too high, wages haven't increased, and there hasn't been enough jobs created. Having that in the front of your mind as the main way to help the high street in the longer term is really important. That doesn't mean that direct interventions on the high streets aren't useful and helpful. There are loads of scenarios where they might be really beneficial. But if you really want to make substantive change and you want to reduce the number of empty shops on a high street, you want to improve the quality of shops, and you want to allow people to access the goods and services that are being sold from those shops, you have to raise their incomes.
Very good. Thank you very much, Oscar. As I said at the beginning, prime ministers come and go, but high streets, particularly in the national debate, endure. I'm sure this won't be the last time that we come back to this topic. All the work that we've been doing on high streets for more than a decade now is available on our website, centreforcities.org. But for now, thanks for listening. Thank you for listening to this episode of City Talks, brought to you by the Centre for Cities. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Podbean by searching Centre for Cities. Please rate and subscribe if you liked what you heard. You can follow the Centre on Twitter at Centre for Cities, all one word, or on LinkedIn for the latest on what the Centre is up to. To hear about all our latest reports and briefings and upcoming events, sign up to our fortnightly newsletter via our website, centreforcities.org. If you have any comments on the episode or suggestions for topics we should cover, we'd love to hear from you. Do tweet us or send us an email to info@centreforcities.org.